Hello and welcome to the Reconnect podcast, a weekly show sponsored by the Anasazi Foundation and powered by Sturry Studios. I'm Ganel-Lyn, your host. I'm so grateful you've joined us, where we have conversations to help you strengthen your most important relationships and reconnect with those that matter most. Hello, welcome to the Reconnect podcast. I'm Ganel-Lyn, your host. We are grateful for the Anasazi Foundation for bringing this podcast to you and the Sturry Studios where we are currently taping this interview. I am thrilled to have a friend of mine here as a guest today. Doug Richens is, I was trying to think and do the math. How long have we known each other? At least 3 years.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But the topic that brought us together is suicide prevention. And I'm so grateful for that one meeting because I became connected with some wonderful individuals, and I feel grateful for the synergy that happened from that project, but also that continues to happen. Doug and I reconnected, no pun intended for the title of the podcast.
You gotta careful on that one.
We reconnected a few months ago, and it's interesting. Here at the Reconnect podcast, we are non-denominational, but we are always talking about anything that helps with connection. And for me and for Doug, faith is at the top of that list. And I had been feeling for a few months that the work I've done around depression, anxiety, and suicide will never stop. But about 4 or 5 years ago, I felt like I was a lone voice out there saying, let's talk about this, and no, it doesn't cause suicide if we talk about it, and how can we frame it, and what do we need to reframe it around so that there's more hope. And then I met individuals like you that were also wanting to talk about those
Yep.
topics. I say I'm the speaker that will talk about the uncomfortable stuff. That's kind of my tagline. But I also have felt this last probably 6 months of the year of 2019, the time of this taping, it's the end of 2019, that there are a lot more people talking about it. Thank goodness. Like, we're having conversations
we have
now.
moved forward.
Yeah. There's other books now, and there's speakers, and there's podcasters, and there's YouTube channels, and there's Instagram accounts that are talking about 5-6 years ago.
And it wasn't just one topic that moved us.
Right.
In my day job, in the work with the church, we address suicide,
Yes.
disabilities, mental health,
All the uncomfortable stuff.
and abuse and incarceration, which we're going to talk more about
Yeah.
today. But we didn't have a language.
No.
It wasn't palatable.
Yeah.
Um,
People had no framework. I mean, even today,
Right.
I just did a high school assembly last week, and before that did another one. And even the leadership, the administration invited me in, and even they knew they needed to do it. We had 3 suicides in 2 weeks in the high school area, but they still weren't sure what it looked like. Like, we talk about the what, but we don't always know how or the why. And now there's a lot more around some of those subjects. But when you reached out to me a few months ago, you brought up something that has quietly become new and dear to my heart and feels like the new frontier a little bit. It feels like what maybe suicide, mental health felt a few months ago. And I think within any faith community, even if you don't affiliate with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, if you're Baptist, if you're Catholic, if you're Muslim, if you're Jewish, I think faith communities have a unique experience around what you just listed: disability, depression, anxiety, and now what we are wanting to talk about,
Right.
which is incarceration.
Yeah.
Is that the best word to use to describe what prisons,
you've
jails?
got internal industry language. You've got language that the communities might identify. I think our point today is the impact of crime and incarceration on victims, on individuals, particularly on families.
On families.
We have, and I think this is the case with many faith traditions, we've ministered to those who are incarcerated while incarcerated. There's movement to address that phase of their journey as they
come out,
like re-enter society, find employment. Huge
resources.
attention there, but enormous barriers
Right.
and challenges. We're looking at what is the impact of crime and incarceration upon the family,
Upon the
children?
family. So before we dive way deep into the deep end on incarceration and the impact on families, which was a great way to say it,
Yeah.
what brought you to this? Like, did you decide as a young college kid, I think I'll go become really good at talking about prisons?
No, I started in the classroom.
Okay, what were you doing?
I was a religious educator
Okay.
with the church, and I was a seminary institute teacher. Early on, I identified some students with disabilities, and I had no idea how to help them. So I began to ask questions to my superiors. How do I help this young kid with reading?
Because you knew they were coming with some unique challenges or limitations or a different lens, and you were ill-equipped as a teacher to reach them.
And at that point, the organization didn't have resources to
Yeah.
help me.
Yeah.
They do now. We've come
Yeah.
a long ways. So I began to study and learn on that. What I learned, I shared. I taught other teachers. I began to just
Be the special ed expert.
a little bit. Eventually,
Okay.
I came to Salt Lake to church headquarters. I was the manager of disability services for church education. We have 700,000 students around the world, 42,000 teachers around
That's
the
a
world.
lot. That's a pretty big educational system right
Languages and
there. Right,
cultural
cultures,
issues.
yeah.
And then one day, I was sitting in my office. A colleague came in and dropped a curriculum on my desk that had been written by religious educators at the Salt Lake prison. And this was a course that they were using in the prison. And he said, would you look into this and see what this is all about? Is this something we need to improve? Where are we at? So I went to the prison and walked through for the first time.
And if you have never done that,
Your first time through is a little
it's a little, I always say
eye-opening.
prisons are prisons. Like,
Yeah.
it looks exactly like you think.
Mhm.
It's one of the areas where I don't think Hollywood has cut corners. And so
No.
it's cement and it's barbed wire and it's gates and guards and it's stark.
And inside, I found people who were
Amazing.
wanting to learn, wanting
Yeah.
to progress. And the curriculum that was thrown on my desk that day, in every way, I could punch holes in it. I didn't feel it was well written. But the results it was getting were staggering.
Which-
They loved the experience. And so that's where I started by saying, how is this product
Creating this
result?
Yeah. And I think that's what's, as a speaker, when you came to me, I had already had a couple of opportunities to speak in the prisons when we talked a few months
Mhm.
ago, and I was quietly on fire because as a speaker, I've done 900 events in 5-6 years, all over the world, all different demographics, religions, corporate, whatever, schools. And when I had the opportunity to speak in the prisons, it was a willing and eager community. They wanted whatever I had brought.
Yeah.
And as a speaker, that's way easier than when I've spoken areas where there's not a need.
And it's that way in all the faith gatherings.
Yes.
It's that way in the literature class. It's
Right.
that way in the education
Across
programs.
the board. These are humble, imperfect. They've made some choices that have put them in a tough spot.
Mhm.
But in general, like you said, even the worst written curriculum, it proves that if the student is hungry,
Yeah.
the teacher can be pretty bad and the books can be subpar, and there's still learning that happens.
So what happened is it sparked in me this opportunity to say we could
Do better.
do better. What's the scope of what we're doing here?
So from that one prison tour, how many prisons did
I've
you?
been in over 100 prisons across the country. Brooklyn Youth Detention, Rikers Island, San Francisco County, Arizona, Utah, all over Texas. The common thread has been those hard realities of the facility with people who are
In trouble.
in trouble. I saw bright spots all the way through. I saw people doing amazing work within our faith tradition, within others, within government, within private agencies. I still struggle to see how everyone's connected.
Because
Well, a lot of
everyone's
people-
on an island in
A
the
little
fog,
bit,
and then
a
the
little
fog
bit.
lifts, and we go, wait, you're doing that too? I'm trying to do that too, yeah.
And we were that way inside of our ministry. And so when I left the church education department, went to a different department, priesthood and family department, started a manager of a group called Special Services. So we had disability, suicide, abuse,
Which is how we connected,
prison,
yeah.
all these other subjects. This, for several years, was just a sliver of my work.
Right. On the list of
On the
special
list.
issues.
And I traveled and I worked in it. A lot of the work I've done is after hours kind of personal ministry work around it.
Why do you think that is? Why has this spoken to you? What was that, do you think, that stirred in you?
I wouldn't say it's not a calling, but it's been more than a
It
job.
feels bigger than the job.
And I'm fascinated by the complexities.
Yeah.
So there's that side of it.
Because there's a Venn diagram. If we could do
Oh my
graphics,
gosh.
right? We could show, like, we think the prisons are like this separate island, which in some literature and movies it has been depicted that way. But really the overlap, right? Whether
you have
it's,
an enormous industry.
right, education,
$80 billion a year supply,
Right.
build, incarcerate industry.
mental health, addiction, family services.
All of the emotional well-being, all of the health issues. Government, you've got politicians getting elected on tough on crime policy.
Locations of prisons, which along the Wasatch Front we just went through.
We just went through that, but prisons are big business
Yeah.
in many states.
Yeah.
It's a significant part of economies.
Rent revenues.
So there's just a lot of factors. At the heart of it is this little nucleus of people. You've got a moment where there was an offender and a victim. That's very simplified, and there's lots of
And
variances
then the
of that.
victim and the offender have families.
But
and
those circles go out. And as I've met with individuals and sat in their homes and interviewed and just heard stories and just listen, they have felt alone. And
Yeah.
they haven't felt like they know where they belong in their community, sometimes in their church, in their schools. Teenagers are embarrassed by
their parent
the parent that's incarcerated. We don't have
framework.
a way to talk about this. In the United States, we have an enormous human rights crisis around mass incarceration. I think we incarcerate 2.3 million people. It's a failed experiment.
2.3 million.
66% of those who are incarcerated have a child under the age of 18.
So let's
For
just make
parents-
this very personal. On Reconnect Podcast, this
Right.
is all about connection, individual or within a family. You have a child under the age of 18. You have a parent, sometimes both parents incarcerated.
Sometimes, or multi-generational.
Right.
I mean, it's
Right, which is then feeding the problem. You have
Mhm.
2.3 million, right? Is that what you said? And then the Venn diagram of that. And then those kids start to identify, right? The natural progression, if you just want to do on the pure social sciences of it all.
and they've labeled it the school to prison pipeline.
Wow.
Right? And it is documentable. It's preventable. There are touch points where we can
Intervene.
educate, we can change, we can intervene
So-
to a large degree.
So you saw the gaps. You saw in all prison systems, you saw the massive amount of people that were being involved in, touched by this system or this issue. And then you can see then, okay, if it's a pipeline, then where are we not intervening? Where are we not, why don't we have the framework like we were talking about, suicide, depression, anxiety, disability, special education, whatever. Just putting words on an issue is a step. So how do we frame it so that it's not an us and them, it's someone else, whether you're the teacher? What are some of those touch points where we have opportunities to intervene and we're maybe missing it? Because if a listener is listening that's like, I don't know anyone in prison, but you're a teacher, you're an educator, you're a clergy, what else?
First of all, it's every family, every home has a
Every
touch point.
family.
So we have to do away with the idea that I don't know anyone
Or that it's an us and them.
or it's us and them. And we are part of a community. Whatever your engagement in that, you're there. 95% of those who are incarcerated will be released.
And
So
then
there's
you're
a little,
a neighbor.
today's prisoners are tomorrow's neighbors. And there is a space to understand needs, to be caring, empathetic.
Because what happens to you happens to me, ultimately.
Yeah. And as I've sat in prisons and talked with people, you can see where they're a victim too.
Most cases, right?
In many, many cases, you can see where the system could have provided a better
Support.
path to their
Because maybe
their
they were
healing.
victimized and they didn't know what to do with that pain, and that
Right.
led to an addiction, which led to a crime, or whatever the
And
scenario.
at the heart of this for me is I strive to be a good citizen, a follower,
A
of
Christian.
Christian, and I think that there is a space where we need to take care of each other.
And we're not talking about it. And we're not talking about it. Beyond that, where do you see the biggest first step gap that as individuals we can be aware of, that we could be part of the solution?
Currently, in our general population of the United States, we are greatly divided in a political context, but also in how we get our information. And we've got media sources that are bringing two very different narratives that meet their industry agendas. I think the first step someone should take is to look broadly across the board. Not listen to this channel or that network, but look at the issue, look at the data. Prepare yourself for a better conversation and really understand the moving parts. And this is a religious term, but we need to be caregivers, we need to be ministers.
Ministers, yeah.
We need to acknowledge the event, what is the criminal behavior and why it is wrong, and recognize there's just a space for help and healing. Families is a place where everyone can start. Those left behind, when a parent is incarcerated and the spouse and the children are behind, their world goes into chaos. There's shame, there's financial downfall, they lost health insurance if dad held the job right, or whatever the scenario. There's so many things that are falling apart
That's a
inside
domino
that home.
effect, yeah.
So we walk in the door, we go to them, and we say, what do you need? Help me understand.
Where,
If you've never been criminal justice involved,
right,
and then you hit it for the first time under crisis,
yes.
you're confused.
It is confusing.
Attorneys, lawyers, procedures,
Parole boards,
fees,
yes.
court fees. It's expensive. And the wheels are falling off. There's trauma. There's a lot of crisis.
Yeah.
So there's a place for comfort, for listening, and whatever role you can give, whatever you can bring to it.
And I think that's really important to understand, that what's coming to my mind as you were talking, Doug, is that we're all neighbors, we're all the teachers, we're doctors, we're nurses, we're postal workers. You know, I know my postman notices when someone's mail is piling up,
Right,
what's happened
yeah.
there, and I'm the one in the neighborhood that will talk to him and say, so-and-so just passed away, they just lost their job, right? I think in our social media world, we probably know more people this is affecting than we realize. I mean, if we stopped and thought about it, wait, I think I saw a post on Facebook about that, or so-and-so, I read something in the paper or online about that. And I think what you're saying is just say, what are the needs? No one is asking you to become the judge and sentence.
No, yeah.
Or decide what was right or wrong. Because I think in this conversation, one of the things I noticed in the prison systems is I want to outreach for the guards. You know, like I go into the prison systems to speak, and sometimes it's the fatigue of the guards that are within that system, or our police, our first responders that are on the front lines, that have experienced some trauma of this constant recidivism rate, you know, that they keep seeing in a community. Or a victim's family. You know, a victim may not be ready to be more public about it, but no one is saying this is what you were trying to lead out with in this conversation today. It's affecting everyone.
It
And
is.
when we don't talk about it, we put head in the sand, right? The prisoner becomes the neighbor. The kid of the prisoner goes to school and starts to use or be a part of gangs because now they're identifying this way. The parent that's left at home is more susceptible to depression, anxiety, which suicide rates go up. Like, that's just one scenario. Like, right?
Right. Yeah.
This is our why. This is why we're talking about.
Here's another word that helps people get involved, is you can ask yourself, could I be a mentor to someone impacted by crime and incarceration? That's a safe word. That's a place
Mentor.
where a mentor. You can come in and you can say, I don't know the criminal justice system, so I can't represent you as an
Right.
attorney, all these different
Right.
things. But in this space, I do know what I'm doing.
Right.
As a parent, or if I'm an educator and your children are going in crisis and you know something about tutoring and helping kids get through hard times, whatever.
Because now the person that helped me do my math homework is now in prison and I can't.
Right.
Yeah.
And to do that with people who look different,
Yes.
who come from a different demographic than yours, is a really bold, big step to take to help communities. Because you cannot separate out of the crime incarceration circles elements of race
Right.
and elements of economics, in geographic location around the country.
So you're saying the demographics show that we have a higher number of population of.
Yes, when I was in Brooklyn a year or so ago, I went to a Brooklyn youth detention facility, saw the mass incarceration, that school to prison pipeline of urban black and brown boys. And as I sat with them and I listened, I realized that I struggled to understand enough of their world to have been a mentor.
Their perspective.
Right? And there's a place where I'm not the guy that can walk in and help.
Validate.
In that setting, I can in others. Years ago, I was with a group of leaders, and we were deciding, there was a need. We were looking at a couple of names of who we might assign to do a certain calling in the church, right, a job. One of the leaders said a very important thing. Said, of all the people on this list we could choose, he said, I like this name. And he pointed to one of the names on the list, and he said, because he has spilt more than I've drunk. He's lived it. He's been through hard times. He's been incarcerated. He's been. So maybe his ministerial background wasn't as strong, or his doctrinal position. But we were asking someone to walk through the door, to sit with people who are in the thick of it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something really powerful about that. If I were a leader of a congregation and I found a need, I might think to myself, wait a second,
Who's been there?
Who's the right person to parachute in?
Yeah.
Now, on this subject, there is the other side of the coin.
Right, which we've talked
of the
about.
victim.
Right, the victim, which.
And this is another place where great sensitivity is needed. It's difficult to understand and comprehend what that is like. If you've been misjudged in your life, maybe there's a touch point close to that, but those who are victimized.
We're not saying that doesn't matter, that
Right.
that doesn't deserve our attention.
And sometimes when you look at, I want to mentor those impacted by crime and incarceration, victims of crime is a phenomenal place to start.
Right.
Educate yourself on the whole spectrum of things. There's a space to go in and help someone rebuild.
Because if we don't do that, what I've noticed is those victims become perpetrators often,
Right.
or we lose them
Or
to
to
some
just-
of these other areas of addiction, depression, suicide. My sister is one example. She was sexually abused. The perpetrator was never brought through the
system.
legal system. She tried years later to bring charges. He had already admitted and helped pay for therapy, but then the statute of limitations had run out, right? This kind of thing. And I remember having hours of conversations with her that she just didn't feel this validation. For those that are familiar with my story, she ended up dying by suicide and taking her life. And part of one of her risk factors was that victim pain that never quite was given a voice, even though we tried as a family to get her that validation, support, and tools and healing she needed. And so I love that you bring that up, Doug. But before we end this conversation, what's coming to mind as a story that would really show the heart of those that are involved?
Two that are both short. I was in the Salt Lake prison.
Yeah.
I was in the women's unit, and it was an afternoon, and it was a class, a religious studies course, and I was visiting, and we were just studying the scriptures. I just sat down and participated in the class. Towards the end, I had a few minutes to ask some questions, and the question I asked, I said, "Why do you come here to this class?"
Because it's not required.
No.
Yeah.
And the first response was sisterhood.
They want a connection.
Yes, they love the content. They care about what they were learning, but they felt what she described. She put the word sisterhood to it. I think that was really significant. Everyone along the way is seeking that. Second story. I was in Boise, Idaho. It's been a year and a half now. It was a Saturday. I had spoke at a large gathering. At the end of that meeting, there was a closing prayer. The guy giving the prayer prayed and mentioned an individual by name who was dying. And then the prayer ended, and the meeting ended, and I asked the bishop there, "What's this all about? Who was he praying for?" There was a brother who had been incarcerated for 17 years, had been attending our church meetings and worship hours and lessons for that whole time. And he had kidney failure. One of the realities in many state prisons and many locations is they don't provide
Medical.
that level of medical dialysis and those kinds of things. So he was dying. I was invited they asked if I wanted to visit with him. I said yes. I went back into the infirmary, found him in a bed, kind of in a morphine-induced coma. I'm staff, right?
Right.
I'm not that leader, but I was there as a human, and I cared, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I held his hand and said, "I'm from the church, and we love you." He woke up.
Wow.
And for a few moments, he became lucid, and we had this brief conversation, and I said, "Is there anything you want me to convey?" And he said, "I felt forgotten." Now I don't mean to hit an emotional chord there. I'm wired this way, but
Listen, we cry at the Reconnect podcast, so you would not be fitting in if you didn't have some emotion.
He had been through it.
Yeah.
He had also had everything that our faith brings to help. He had participated in everything we offer. And then at the end, he still felt forgotten. Which wasn't about a worship hour. It wasn't about great members coming in to minister during those assigned hours.
Solve all the problems.
I think, and I've reflected on this a million times, but I think he was felt forgotten by his people, his nation. After he said that, I just held his hand for a moment. He kind of slipped back into his coma. He passed away about 5 hours later.
Wow.
And
So his last connection conversation was
quite
with
literally.
Wow. Thank you, Doug, for
So if there's some things that motivate me,
it's that person.
these conversations, whether it's the victim, the families, the offender, we can't forget that there's needs.
One of my most favorite pieces of literature and music and work is Les Mis.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as a young child, I happened to find one version of that on public television at the age of 7. And it was a series for like 3 days. And it gave me horrible nightmares because this version of Les Mis was all the prisoners were on an island and there were big walls. And Jean Valjean had this long beard and long hair because no one cut the prisoner's hair. And he escapes. And his number is branded on his arm. And if you know this story, right, that he goes on and a kind bishop invites him to stay, and then he's caught stealing the silver because he's tried to get a job and he wants to make a change and he wants a different life, and society sees literally the number on his arm, and the soldiers find him and bring him back, and that kind bishop says, "Oh, my friend, you left without the most important, the candlesticks."
Yeah.
And he bought his soul that day. And then Jean Valjean goes on to, make this contribution to the world, but still is always struggling with this shame of who he was and why he was put in prison and how much he tries to make. And then Javert is juxtaposed, right? You see him as the upstanding citizen, the us and them, right? And he has everything, and then we hear more about his shame story, which was that his mother was a prostitute, and he was going to make sure everything in society was black and white. And in the end, that destroys his soul because he learns
There's no love.
There's no love.
Yeah. And that role of the priest, one of the most important things, opportunities I have, is I see citizens, people across the country acting in that capacity.
Yes.
They're creating jobs that are offender-friendly, services for victims. Teachers who are accommodating and kind to a student whose family is going through something. That is happening.
Mental health professionals.
It's happening across the board. And at the same time,
Javert.
we have more people who need to wake up and respond.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's why
Progress and respond, not wake up. But
Well,
they need to progress.
Well, and that's exactly why I wanted you on the podcast today, because I think we have these conversations to give words so that as a neighbor oh wait, I heard that podcast, Doug and Ganel-Lyn were talking, and I could just ask. People ask, say, what do I say after this suicide or this drug overdose or this divorce? Just ask. What would
Start
support,
talking.
What would support look like? I know there's some hard things happening in your family right now. What would support look like? We both were just told about a story of a woman who came to a meeting we were at, and she's been in prison. It was white collar crime, and her children, in the life of a child from 12 to 14 or 15 is a lot of growing. And we asked her in this meeting, what did people do that was helpful? She said everyone from church communities to schools treated her children not like it was a secret, but that this was something that they would incorporate. Like, have you heard from your mom? Has she written letters? Did you let her know? Oh, she'll be so excited to hear you did so good on that spelling test, right? And helping those kids navigate this really big, heavy thing, I think is, to quote Victor Hugo, is to love another person is to see the face of God. Yeah. That's what's on Meg's headstone. And I appreciate you, Doug, so much. I appreciate you having this conversation. And I know I can feel, when emotion is tender like this on the podcast, I can feel the effect that it's happening. I don't want to live in a society where we don't hold people accountable for wrongdoing. But I also don't want to live in a society that we have so many Javerts that are crumbling inside because it's too black and white, and we're not loving each other. Any closing thoughts?
Thank you. We have a great deal of work to do to
this is the beginning, right?
Change the narrative, increase understanding. Everyone needs to find their voice and their place of comfort around these topics, but these topics aren't going away.
Yeah.
We really are at a place where...
No matter how big of the walls we build around the prisons, there's not a wall big enough, right?
And there's so many good people involved. I'm grateful for them.
Yeah.
So I hope we can contribute.
Yes. Thank you. And thank you for opening up the conversation, doing the work. There's great research out there. There's resources, and like you said, there's more resources than you probably realize. Community services. I think if you own your own business and you're willing to hire someone that's just come out, what a great
Tremendous
gift.
need.
Because like Jean Valjean, how do you move forward if this has become 20 years of your identity or whatever time you've spent in prison, and what hope we can offer?
You know what else? That's one thing for me to come on and talk about this. There is a group of people who will hear this, who have been through it. Some of them are ready to talk. And the society is ready to listen. And I think there's just place for those to consider, are they able to say more than they've said in the past, to tell their story. I am finding so many people that want to do that. I also find those who have been through it and they just say, I'm not there yet.
I'm not there yet, yeah.
But I think there are some that are being prepared to speak to this in a more direct way, a more experiential way.
Yeah, I think Les Mis would have had a totally different ending if Jean Valjean had been given permission to tell his story from the moment he left.
Right, yeah.
Instead of hide it.
Yeah.
That shame is what feeds the disconnect, right? And instead of saying, yeah, this is where I came from, and oh, I'm ready to work hard for you. And I think that's a really good takeaway, Doug. That
It requires so much courage
to say, this is what I've done.
to say this is what I've been through, this is what our family's been through.
This is where we've been, yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think as those individuals are prepared, I hope
Thank you.
they'll speak to it. That'll help.
Thank you for bringing that up, because you're right. I feel that too, that a listener that has gone through it, I hope you'll hear that Doug and I encourage you to share. We take away the power when we take away the secrets.
We do.
And I know that here at the Reconnect podcast, that connection's complicated, and these aren't easy topics. We're not bringing the talk about it for 30, 40 minutes and we've got all the answers, but some of these conversations need to start, and I think Doug and I both feel around this subject specifically. Where we were at on mental health 5 or 6 years ago, this is a new frontier. So if you want to join us in this conversation, sharing this podcast then ripples out to another conversation happening in another home, in another community, and that's what I love about this platform. So thank you, brother, for being here.
Bet.
And thank you for joining us here at the Reconnect podcast. Thank you, Anasazi Foundation and Sturry Studios, for making this happen, and we'll see you again at the Reconnect podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Reconnect podcast, presented by Anasazi Foundation. Are you worried about your teenager? Are they struggling with depression, low self-esteem, anger, drugs, or suicidal thoughts and feelings? If so, Anasazi Foundation can help. Anasazi is a wilderness therapy program for at-risk youth, and our mission is to help turn hearts homeward. To learn more about us, please visit anasazi.org. If you liked this show, please be sure to subscribe and leave us a review. Thank you again.